Rachel Dean walked through the main corridor of Redstone Base, her boots making a steady, rhythmic sound against the polished floors. The worn edges of her uniform spoke of time, of places where uniforms weren't meant to last, faded fabric, frayed stitching, a story of service no one could see at first glance. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her head held high, despite the whispering and pointed stares from the officers around her. A young lieutenant, no older than 25, sneered as she passed, his voice carrying just loud enough for her to hear. "What's she doing here? This is a military base, not a history class." He chuckled to his friend, who responded with a low, mocking laugh. Rachel continued walking, her face stoic, as the conversation behind her picked up, growing more venomous. "Someone should tell her this isn't a costume party," another officer said, his words laced with condescension. It was clear they saw only what was in front of them, an older woman in a battered uniform. Without the shiny medals and ribbons that defined a decorated soldier, she wasn't wearing the right insignia, and in their eyes, she was just a civilian who somehow wandered into the wrong place. None of them knew who she really was or what that uniform represented, and she wasn't about to explain. As Rachel moved deeper into the base, more whispers swirled around her, mixing with the sound of polished boots tapping against the floor. She didn't react, didn't flinch. Her steps were deliberate, measured, each one echoing in the stillness of the hallway. Her silence, however, made her presence all the more palpable. The officers watching her, from the young lieutenant to the senior sergeant, couldn't help but notice how calm she was, how unbothered. It was almost as though she had seen it all before, like the mockery didn't touch her, like she didn't care about the opinions of people who had never even seen half the things she had, and in truth, they hadn't. The younger officers, huddled together, continued to gossip, their voices louder now, emboldened by the knowledge that Rachel wasn't responding. "That uniform's a disgrace. It makes the rest of us look bad," one of them muttered, clearly oblivious to the weight of his words. They had no idea how much history lay behind those faded threads. They couldn't see the marks of battle and service on her back, the sweat and blood soaked into the fabric that they only saw as worn out cloth. But Rachel knew, and that was enough. She didn't need to defend herself. She knew who she was, even if they didn't. Every wrinkle on her uniform represented a mission that had been completed, missions that had saved lives, altered the course of events, and remained classified. But these young officers, in their pristine uniforms, with their polished boots and freshly minted ranks, couldn't comprehend the weight of it. They couldn't understand the silent strength it took to walk into a room where you were invisible, where no one knew the sacrifices you'd made, and still stand tall. The whispers didn't matter. The sneers didn't matter. A young sergeant, seeing her move past the officers, stepped forward with a slight tilt of his head. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" His voice, though polite, carried a hint of condescension, a belief that he was doing her a favor by questioning her presence. Rachel paused just for a moment, her eyes meeting his with quiet resolve. She nodded politely, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corners of her lips, and continued walking. There was nothing more she could say. She had learned long ago that some truths were too classified to share, too dangerous to explain. As she neared the end of the corridor, the murmurs behind her continued, growing more pronounced, their tone heavier. Rachel, however, didn't let them break her composure. She wasn't here to explain herself. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was here for something far more important than their approval. Something they would never understand, at least not yet. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the whole base had been holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But Rachel, a woman who had lived through hell and back, walked on, her gaze steady, her demeanor unwavering. Every person who had passed her in the corridor, judging her, mocking her, would soon learn the truth. But for now, she kept her silence, letting the weight of her history speak louder than any of their words ever. Rachel reached the memorial hall, the soft murmur of voices behind her fading into nothing. She didn't need to look back. The whispers would die out soon enough, replaced with awe. Perhaps, or at least confusion. What they saw was just the surface. What they didn't see, what they could never see, was the hidden legacy she carried. The story had only just begun. The heat of the desert air clung to the skin, heavy and oppressive. As Rachel Dean sat in the cockpit of an A-10 Warthog, her hands steady on the controls, the mission was a whisper, a ghost among the ranks of conventional forces. Only a few men and women knew what was really happening. As the plane soared low over a hostile landscape, the mountains rising like silent sentinels below. Rachel's mind was sharp, focused. This was her world where shadowed operations unfolded in places no map acknowledged. It was where the traditional rules of warfare didn't apply, where everything was at stake. Yet, nobody would ever hear about it. The mission briefing had been sparse, the usual for Shadow Talon, a terrorist group, hidden deep within the borders of a country where U.S. forces couldn't openly operate, was planning something catastrophic. No one knew exactly what, only that it was big, too big to ignore. Rachel's role wasn't to ask questions. It was to stop it, whatever it was, no matter the cost. She wasn't part of a unit that followed normal military procedures. She worked in the shadows, never seen, never celebrated, but always necessary. Flying the A-10 Warthog, an aircraft built for close air support, Rachel's task was one of precision. She maneuvered through a series of tight turns, the G-forces pressing her body into the seat, as she kept her eyes on the target below. Her mission to provide air support to a ground unit attempting to infiltrate a heavily guarded compound. She dropped her ordnance with practiced precision, the explosion rippling through the valley as the enemy compound was torn apart. The roar of the Warthog's engine became a part of the landscape, blending into the harsh environment, as if she were just another shadow moving with purpose. In these moments, the noise of the world disappeared, and the weight of every decision, every breath, felt amplified. Rachel executed a textbook emergency maneuver when a missile lock flashed across her radar, a sharp, shrill warning piercing the cockpit. With the reflexes of someone who had been through more combat zones than she could count, she rolled the aircraft hard, pulling out of the threat trajectory just as the missile detonated behind her. The explosion lit up the sky like a brief sun, but she didn't flinch. Her hands were steady on the controls, her mind already calculating the next move. There was no room for panic, no time for hesitation. Rachel had learned long ago that it wasn't the visible marks that made a soldier, it was the quiet resilience, the ability to operate in conditions that could break the unprepared. Her missions were always classified. The names of the people she saved, the lives she altered, remained hidden from the public. There would be no medals, no public recognition for her role in preventing a disaster. She did it because it needed to be done. And when the mission was over, she returned to the shadows, to the silence, where even the smallest mistake could cost lives. One of her most significant operations had taken place a few years ago, deep within enemy territory. She had been tasked with infiltrating a compound to disable a weapons cache that, if it fell into the wrong hands, would shift the balance of power in the region. The team was small, but deadly, trained for operations where failure wasn't an option. They moved under the cover of darkness, their movements synchronized and calculated. Rachel had taken on the role of lead scout, moving ahead of the others, securing routes and ensuring there were no surprises. The success of the mission hinged on them remaining unseen, unheard. As the mission unfolded, Rachel was forced to make split-second decisions, each one weighing heavily on her. A decision to go left instead of right had saved her team from an ambush, a quiet moment in the darkness of the compound, where she had to disable a guard silently without alerting others, had ensured that the weapons cache was neutralized before the enemy could react. In the end, the operation was a success, but not a single soul would know of her involvement. The media would never report it. Her name would never appear in any military report. To the world, the mission never even happened. In those quiet moments, back in the shadows of her life, Rachel never asked for thanks. She didn't need it. The work she did wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about protecting the innocent, about making sure that the ones who needed to be stopped never had a chance to act. She had carried the weight of those unspoken victories in her soul, each operation a chapter in a story that no one would ever read. But Rachel knew. She carried it in her spine, etched into her very being, the mark of a soldier whose service would never be acknowledged. This was the price of being a part of Shadow Talon, the price of serving in the shadows. For Rachel, the scars weren't on her body, but in her memory, hidden and invisible to everyone else, but always there, a reminder of the battles fought in silence. And as she piloted the A-10 Warthog, as she executed the complex maneuvers, her heart never wavered. The mission was all that mattered. The lives saved, the enemies neutralized, would remain forever unknown. But in the deepest parts of her being, Rachel carried the weight of them all. The intensity of that work, of that quiet service, shaped every part of who she was. Her silence was not weakness, but strength to endure the things that could never be told, the things that were too secret to be shared. In the shadows, Rachel was not just surviving, she was serving in ways that no one could ever truly understand. Rachel's steps were steady as she moved deeper into the heart of Redstone. Base! The corridor stretched out before her, bustling with officers, their crisp uniforms standing in stark contrast to the worn edges of her own. Her manila folder, containing the paperwork required for the memorial, was clutched tightly in her hand. She could feel the stares, the whispers beginning to rise again, like the low hum of a storm building just over the horizon. The younger officers were watching her now, their eyes narrowed, their words just loud enough for her to catch. She knew exactly what they were saying. They were all too willing to make assumptions based on her appearance alone. The whispers grew louder as she walked past them, echoing off the polished walls of the base. Who let this one in one voice sneered. Does she even know what a military base is? Another added. Rachel didn't flinch, didn't let the words land. She knew how to ignore the noise. It was a skill she had perfected over the years, learned during countless operations when survival depended on it. Her focus never wavered, her eyes locked ahead as if nothing in the world could distract her from the task at hand. Then, as she approached a group of officers near the entrance to the memorial hall, the tension in the air thickened. A young lieutenant, perhaps feeling the need to assert his authority, stepped directly into her path. His sharp uniform stood out like a beacon, clean and crisp, almost too perfect. Without a word, he bumped into her shoulder, just hard enough to knock the manila folder from her hands. The papers scattered across the floor, a dozen sheets of classified documents tumbling out for anyone to see. Rachel didn't react. She bent down slowly, her movements calm, deliberate, as she gathered the papers. But the young lieutenant was still standing over her, his presence looming as if expecting some sort of acknowledgement. He was enjoying the moment, relishing in the small victory of knocking her off balance. "Careful there, recruit," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "This is a place for professionals, not tourists." The words felt like an insult, but Rachel didn't let them land. The lieutenant's tone grew more condescending, his voice carrying across the now silent hallway. "You know, there are regulations about wearing military uniforms, especially worn-out ones. Makes the rest of us look bad." Rachel ignored him, her focus solely on the task of collecting her papers. But inside, her pulse was steady, calm. This wasn't the first time she had been dismissed for her appearance, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. She knew better than anyone how to walk through this world without revealing. The truth she carried, truths that, if spoken aloud, could tear the very fabric of this place apart. As she stood up, the lieutenant, still hovering, watched her closely, not realizing that he was playing a game he didn't understand. His face was full of smug satisfaction, his hands resting on his hips as if he were the one in control. But Rachel didn't need to prove anything to him or to anyone else. She had learned long ago that it wasn't in the dramatic moments that soldiers were made, it was in the quiet ones, the ones where your name would never be called, and your sacrifice would never be recorded. The whispers behind her grew louder, and she could feel the weight of the judgment in the air. She could hear them now, clearly comments about her uniform, her age, her presence in a place she didn't belong. "Someone's grandmother donated her old uniform," one of the officers muttered. "It's embarrassing." Rachel's grip on the folder tightened as she stood tall, not a single word escaping her lips. She knew the truth of her service. She didn't need their approval, didn't need their understanding. But as she walked away, heading toward the memorial hall, the young lieutenant still lingered in the background, his laughter fading into the noise of the base. He didn't know it, but this small act of mockery would come back to haunt him. Her steps were deliberate as she moved down the hall, the tension in the air growing heavier with each step. The officers watched her, their voices now hushed as she walked past. They didn't understand who she was or why she was there. But Rachel carried on, undeterred. She had nothing to prove to them, only to the memory of the soldiers she came to honor. Then, just as Rachel neared the entrance to the memorial hall, a familiar voice called out to her this time, not from the group of officers, but from someone much higher up. Brigadier General Holloway had been passing through the hallway, his sharp eyes catching sight of Rachel's tattoo, the Black Hawk wings emblazoned across her back. It was a symbol that only a select few would recognize, a mark of a soldier who had served in the shadows, whose name would never appear in a report. The general's face, once neutral, began to change as he realized who she was. The whispers behind Rachel fell silent, and the lieutenant, still hovering in the background, suddenly looked uncertain. The tension in the hall shifted from mockery to something else. Something heavier, more serious. The young officer's expression faltered as General Holloway took a step forward. His gaze locked on Rachel's back. He had seen that symbol before years ago, in a classified briefing that few had ever been cleared to attend. And with that, the mockery ended. The moment of recognition was here. The young lieutenant, still not fully grasping the gravity of what he had just witnessed, stood frozen, his face pale as the realization slowly dawned on him. Rachel didn't need to explain herself any longer. She had carried the weight of this moment in silence, waiting for the right time to reveal the truth. As Rachel bent down to collect the scattered papers, she caught a glimpse of the reflection on the polished floor, and for a moment, her fingers paused. The subtle shift in the air around her wasn't lost on her. Something had changed. Brigadier General Holloway, who had been moving down the corridor, stopped abruptly as his eyes fell on the tattoo etched along the back of Rachel's shirt. The Black Hawk wings, wrapped around an encoded symbol, were unmistakable for a brief moment. The general's expression shifted from routine concern to something far more serious. His gaze locked onto the tattoo, and the weight of recognition hit him like a heavy blow. Holloway's mind raced, flashes of a classified briefing from years ago rushing to the forefront of his memory. He remembered reading the file, the only one of its kind, Talon 1, a black operation so classified that even the existence of the mission had been shrouded in secrecy. A single operative had survived that mission, and the file had noted only a small diagram of the Shadow Talon emblem. It was this very symbol that Rachel now wore, permanently inked on her skin as a silent testament to a mission that had saved thousands but had never made the news. The reality of who Rachel truly was began to sink in, and Holloway's breath caught in his chest. He stepped forward, his usual composed demeanor faltering for a split second as he reached Rachel. The officers around them had been oblivious, mocking and jeering at her, but now the mood had shifted, a ripple of tension coursing through the group. Holloway could see the lieutenant who had taunted Rachel earlier still, standing at the edge of the crowd, his face pale and frozen in confusion as the significance of the moment became clear. Rachel, completely unaware of the impact of the tattoo on the general, continued to collect her papers, her movements calm and measured. With a subtle motion, Holloway cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the nearby officers. His voice, when it came, was firm, though there was a tinge of disbelief beneath the professionalism. "Lieutenant," he said, his tone sharper than usual, "I believe you've made a grave mistake." The young officer, who had just moments before relished in his minor victory over Rachel, now looked like a child caught in a game he didn't understand. He stood there, awkwardly shifting, his earlier confidence dissolving into uncertainty. Holloway's eyes remained on Rachel, his respect for her unspoken but undeniable. He had seen firsthand the sacrifices of those who served in the shadows, those whose names were never spoken in the light of day. This woman, standing before him, had lived through things that would break most men, but she stood tall, her composure unwavering. Despite the lack of recognition, her silence was her strength, her unwillingness to explain herself a reflection of the discipline that had been drilled into her for years. The whispers that had once filled the hallway began to die down, replaced with an uncomfortable quiet. The officers, still unaware of the full extent of Rachel's past, began to feel the weight of the general's shift in demeanor. They had seen him deal with all sorts of situations, but never like this. Never with a soldier who had been dismissed as unworthy. Just moments before, Holloway stepped closer, his eyes now steady on Rachel as he addressed the gathered crowd. "This woman is not who you think she is," he said, his voice low but carrying across the room. "She represents something far greater than any of you can understand. Shadow Talon operates in the spaces where the rest of you can't even imagine." Rachel remained silent as General Holloway's words filled the room. She knew what was coming, and though the revelation was now inevitable, it didn't change anything for her. She had never asked for recognition. She had never sought acknowledgement for the battles fought, the missions completed, or the lives saved. But in this moment, standing before a group of people who had judged her so harshly, she felt the weight of years of silent service finally being acknowledged. The truth was out, but it was not a truth she had ever sought to tell. The lieutenant, still stunned, looked at the general for guidance, his face pale and confused. He was unable to comprehend what was happening. He had no idea that the very woman he had mocked so carelessly was the sole survivor of a mission that had kept him safe, along with countless others. Holloway's expression softened as he turned to the lieutenant, his voice cold but steady. "You have no idea who you've been mocking. Lieutenant, not a clue." The lieutenant swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance evaporating in the face of Holloway's command. The general turned back to Rachel, his voice softer now, full of genuine respect. "Ma'am," he said, his words weighted with years of understanding, "I owe you an apology. What's more, I owe you thanks for a service that the rest of us will never fully understand." Rachel's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. But in that brief exchange, Holloway saw the respect he had been searching for, an unspoken acknowledgement of her sacrifices. For a moment, there was no sound in the corridor except for the soft shuffle of feet as the gathered officers absorbed the significance of the revelation. Holloway stepped back, his gaze never leaving Rachel as the officers around him slowly began to understand the gravity of the situation. Rachel had come to this base to honor the fallen, to represent those who had given everything without ever being recognized. Now, she was about to receive recognition not for the service that had defined her, but for the very silence in which it had been carried out. Holloway's gaze swept across the room, and with a solemn nod, he gave the order, "You will salute her, as I do." The officers, their faces still marked with confusion, hesitated for only a second before they followed his lead. The salute was slow at first, unsure, but as it spread through the ranks, it became more than just a gesture. It was a recognition of the truth, of Rachel's quiet, unseen heroism. As Rachel stood there, silent and still, the weight of the moment finally began to settle in. The men and women who had dismissed her, who had mocked her for something they couldn't understand, were now saluting her. They would never know the full story, how she had fought, how she had bled, how she had sacrificed, but in that moment, they saw her, truly saw her, and offered the only tribute they could. For Rachel, it was enough, but it would never be more than a fleeting recognition. The real work, the real service, was always in the silence, and she had carried that burden, without need for praise, without need for thanks, for as long as she could remember. As the silence grew thick in the hallway, General Holloway stood before Rachel, his expression now solemn, his eyes no longer filled with the casual concern he had shown moments before. The officers around them, once so sure of themselves, had fallen into a quiet stillness, their earlier mockery hanging in the air like a thick cloud. Holloway took a step closer to Rachel, his gaze never wavering from her. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but filled with a depth that made the rest of the room listen intently. "Ma'am," he began, his words measured and precise, "I owe you an apology." The room seemed to hold its breath, every officer present suddenly aware that something monumental was happening. Holloway paused, his eyes scanning the room before settling back on Rachel. "What you've endured here today is a mistake, and I intend to make it right." Rachel remained silent, her face unreadable, though there was a slight shift in her posture, a subtle acknowledgement that she had expected nothing less. Holloway took another step forward, the tension palpable as he reached for the sharp, formal salute that was only reserved for those who had earned the deepest respect within the military. "You've served in ways most of us will never understand. Your sacrifices, your actions are beyond what any of us could have imagined," he said, his voice steady but laced with genuine reverence. Without hesitation, General Holloway rendered a salute, not the standard military one, but the special recognition salute reserved for shadow talon personnel, a symbol of silent respect for those who operated in the shadows. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of Rachel's unspoken heroism. The officers who had once taunted her now stood frozen, caught off guard by the weight of the moment. The recognition they had so callously dismissed was now undeniable. The base, once bustling with the chatter of young officers and the hum of routine, now stood still. The younger officers, including the lieutenant who had been so quick to mock Rachel, looked around in confusion, slowly realizing that they had made a grave error. They had no idea who Rachel truly was or what her uniform represented, and the gravity of that truth began to settle in. As General Holloway held his salute, the rest of the room stood motionless for a moment before the first officer slowly raised his hand in the same gesture. One by one, the others followed, a ripple of respect spreading through the room. As each officer offered their salute to the woman they had wrongly judged, the room was silent, save for the soft sounds of boots shuffling on the floor. As each officer paid tribute to Rachel, the lieutenant, still stunned by the shift in atmosphere, stood with his mouth slightly open, unable to fully grasp the depth of what had just unfolded. Rachel, for her part, remained composed, the faintest nod of her head acknowledging the salutes. It was a quiet acceptance, one that spoke of years of serving without recognition, years spent in the shadows where heroes weren't celebrated, only needed. But in that moment, with the entire base offering her this rare and special salute, something shifted. The officers around her, who had once viewed her with derision, now saw her for what she truly was, a soldier who had given everything without ever asking for acknowledgement. Holloway, his salute still held high, turned to the room once more, "This is how we should treat all who serve," he said, his voice steady and firm, with respect, with dignity, and with an understanding that some sacrifices are too great to be seen by those who aren't trained to look. His words resonated through the room, settling into the minds of those who had previously mocked Rachel. They now understood that true heroism often walks unnoticed, and that sometimes the greatest service is the one that leaves no visible mark. The lieutenant, still standing at the edge of the group, felt the weight of the general's words, his face flush with embarrassment. He had no idea that the woman he had so thoughtlessly dismissed had saved countless lives he would never know about. The realization hit him with a force that left him paralyzed. Rachel's silence, once perceived as weakness, was now recognized as strength, as endurance, and as a reflection of a service so deep that it defied recognition. The general slowly lowered his hand, and as he did, the others followed suit. The salute was not just a sign of respect for Rachel, but a symbol of the deep shift in understanding that had taken place. In this moment, Rachel was no longer invisible. The soldiers around her had finally recognized the magnitude of her service and the silent heroism she embodied. The room remained silent for a few moments longer, the officers still standing at attention, processing the gravity of the situation. Rachel stood still, her posture upright, her gaze focused ahead, not seeking praise but allowing herself this rare moment of recognition. The truth of her past had been revealed, and with it, a deeper respect had been earned not just from those around her, but from the very system that had once overlooked her. As the final officer lowered their salute, the tension in the room slowly ebbed away. General Holloway gave a final, approving nod before turning to lead Rachel towards the memorial hall. The officers slowly began to disperse, their heads lowered, each one lost in thought, reflecting on the lesson they had just learned. Rachel, as always, remained composed, walking beside the general with quiet dignity. The recognition had come, not because she had sought it, but because the truth had finally been revealed. And in that moment, as the doors to the memorial hall opened before them, Rachel knew that her legacy, though it had remained hidden for so long, had finally been acknowledged. Her silence had carried more weight than any words ever could. Rachel stood silently in front of the memorial wall, her gaze fixed on the simple inscription etched into the stone. The wall was devoid of names, of ranks, or medals, just a plain, unadorned reminder that some service could never be publicly acknowledged. It stood quietly against the backdrop of Redstone Base, almost unnoticeable unless one truly sought to understand its significance. To most, it was just another part of the installation, a background feature among many others, but to Rachel, it held more meaning than any grand monument could ever capture. The inscription was simple: "To those who served in ways that will never be publicly acknowledged." It spoke to the quiet sacrifices made by those who operated in the shadows, whose deeds were too classified, too secret, to ever be known by the general public. Rachel had been one of those soldiers, one of those who had given everything, who had faced unimaginable risks, all while remaining invisible. Her name would never be etched into this wall, but she knew the weight of her contributions. And in some way, so did the others who truly understood the nature of silent service. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air of the base fill her lungs as she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The emotions that had been held tight for so long began to surface, but she kept them under control. This was not the time for displays of emotion. This was her time to honor those who had given everything without the hope of recognition, those who had carried the weight of the world on their shoulders without ever seeking the spotlight. In the silence, Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of reverence for those who had stood where she now stood, bearing the invisible scars that only those who had walked the same path could truly understand. The officers who had mocked her earlier, the ones who had so easily dismissed her, were now part of a new understanding. They had saluted her, recognized her service, but they would never fully grasp the depth of it. This was the price of being a shadow soldier you served without the world ever knowing. You were the first line of defense, the ones who carried the burdens no one could see, and when it was over, you faded into the background again. But that was the way it had always been for Rachel. Recognition had never been the goal. It wasn't about being seen or celebrated. It was about doing what needed to be done, quietly, efficiently, and without hesitation. As Rachel stood before the memorial, her thoughts drifted to the countless others who had served in ways no one would ever speak of. They were the ones who had gone to places where maps had no names, where threats loomed just out of sight. They were the unsung heroes, the ones who would never appear in history books, their sacrifices too dangerous to be spoken aloud. And yet, without them, the world would be a much darker place. Rachel knew that her work, her sacrifices, had been part of that invisible thread that had kept the world safe. She had been a protector in the shadows, and that was enough. The memorial before her was not just a wall of stone, it was a symbol of every person who had served quietly, without fanfare, without applause. The names would never be publicly acknowledged, but the service was no less important. Rachel thought of the families who would never know the full truth of the operations their loved ones had been part of the soldiers who had never come back, whose sacrifices had been buried deep within the secrecy of classified missions. This was their tribute. This wall a silent acknowledgement that true heroism often walks in silence. Rachel lingered for a moment longer, her hand resting gently on the cold stone. The silence around her was peaceful, almost reverent, as if the base itself understood the gravity of what she had given. She didn't need more recognition. The small salute from General Holloway, the quiet acknowledgement from the officers, had been enough. She had always known that some heroes would never be publicly recognized, but their legacies would live on in the hearts of those who understood. The silence was her reward, and it was the most profound form of respect she could receive. As she turned to leave, the weight of the moment still heavy on her shoulders, Rachel felt a quiet sense of peace. The world outside the base would continue to spin, oblivious to the sacrifices made by people like her, people like the ones she had come to honor. But for Rachel, this was enough. She had served in silence, and that silence had been heard. The unspoken respect from her peers, the understanding from General Holloway. It all meant more than any ceremony ever could. She had done her duty. Walking away from the memorial, Rachel knew that some stories were never meant to be told. The most important victories were the ones that remained unseen. And the true legacy of a soldier wasn't measured in medals or accolades, but in the quiet, enduring strength of their service. She had given her all, and that was enough. In the end, it was the silent warriors like her who carried the weight of the world, quietly, humbly, and without expectation.